Yeah, I'm Jeff Halper, and I'm the head of an Israeli uh, political organization. It's called the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions, which is one of the, I would say, one of the important organizations in Israel working to end the occupation and working for a just peace with the Palestinians. But over all the years that I've been working on this issue, on the ground, sitting under bulldozers that have come to demolish homes, one question was always nagging in my mind, and that was, how does Israel get away with this? In other words, here you have an occupation, I'm assuming, that people have a general sense of the map if you're here tonight, but you have an occupation of more than 50 years, a brutal occupation involving, but not just occupation, even before the occupation, but certainly occupations in 1967, in which Israel is in violation of dozens of UN resolutions. It's in violation of international policies, including that of the Czech Republic, including that of the EU, which is a two-state solution, which isn't going to happen, but that's at least the idea, is to end the occupation. A brutal occupation. Israel's demolished about 55,000 Palestinian homes since 1967. In violation of human rights conventions, in violation of international law, certainly the Fourth Geneva Convention that protects people living under occupation has been violated item by item. You see Israeli soldiers becoming even more brutal all the time on TV. It's happening on the southern border of Europe, in the Holy Land, no less. I mean, this isn't happening in some faraway place, in a jungle, on a mountainside, in a desert, in a marginal place that nobody notices. This is right in our faces. And in fact, as the occupation goes on, it becomes more brutal. Israel's international reputation improves. Its standing in the EU improves. It gets more funding. Now there's what's called Horizon 2020, in which the EU is funding a tremendous amount of Israeli military research and development. Israel's been elected to the OECD, the exclusive club of the most advanced economies in the world. And Netanyahu flies around the world like a king. In other words, Israel's paying no price whatsoever for this. Not only aren't there pressures, but in fact, it seems to have no effect whatsoever on Israel's international standing, especially in the Czech Republic. You guys are the most pro-Israel country in Europe. So the question is why? And the usual explanations didn't really work everywhere. The explanation of the Jewish lobby. Well, the Jewish lobby might work in the US. It's very powerful there. Here and there, but that doesn't explain most of Europe. Certainly doesn't explain China, India, Brazil. They become much more friendly to Israel and supportive of Israel over the years. You can talk about guilt over the Holocaust. Well, that might work here and in Germany and parts of Europe. That really isn't a factor in the United States or in Asia or in Latin America. You could talk about the impact of evangelical Christians, which is really important. But in certain places like the United States, like Latin America even. But I don't think they have a tremendous impact in Europe or in Asia and other places. In other words, every explanation that you hear doesn't really explain. It might explain certain sympathies towards Israel in particular places, but they don't explain the global, what's the word I'm looking for? not the global reach, but the global, how Israel is really improving its international relationships globally. And so I began to look for what's really going on here. Why does Israel have this status? Why is it able to not only maintain the occupation, but to really become an international player? And as I'm in the West Bank, and of course living in Israel, it became clearer and clearer to me that the answer lies somewhere in the whole realm of security. I mean, you can't be in Israel for 10 minutes without security hitting you over the head. Everything is security. So that I began to look at this from that direction. And it turns out, of course, that from the Israeli point of view, there is no occupation. An occupation is defined in international law as a temporary military situation. That's not how Israel looks at this situation. Zionism, I'm not going to get into this whole thing, but it lays a certain foundation. Zionism was really a settler colonial movement. In other words, not to say that Jews didn't have some kind of a tie to the country, religious or ideological or historical or sentimental. It doesn't matter. The point is they took settler colonialism as the method by which they were going to settle Palestine. So the idea was that this is our country exclusively. This country belongs to the Jews. There's no other claimant. No other people have rights. We knew there were Arabs in the country, but one of the slogans of the Zionist movement was, it's a land without a people. By people, they meant a people in the sense of a collective, of a national group that have national rights. That doesn't exist. They were a bunch of Arabs living there, basically. And the idea was that the Zionist movement is coming to take over the country. They weren't coming as immigrants. They weren't coming to integrate into an already existing country. They were coming to a country to take it over. Very much like the United States and Canada, like the French in Algeria, like the Australians, New Zealand, South Africa. I mean, there are many cases of settler colonial countries. So the point is that settler colonialism is unilateral. So there's no conflict. We talk about the Arab-Israeli conflict. It's not a conflict because there's no two sides. From the Israeli point of view, there is no Palestinian side. There's only one side, and that's ours, and our job is to take over the country. And the Arabs have no role in this whatsoever. They have to be displaced or confined, and that's it. We're not negotiating with them. They're not a side. We're not going to compromise with them. They have no standing, basically. So from that point of view, then, in other words, the idea being unilateral, to transform an Arab country into a Jewish country, to transform Palestine into the land of Israel. So in that situation, there is no occupation. In 1967, when Israel took the West Bank and East Jerusalem and Gaza, they weren't occupying a foreign place. They were taking the last pieces of the land of Israel in this 100-year process of colonizing Palestine. So that even though the international community considers this an occupation, which is temporary, that's not how Israel sees it. So from Israel's point of view, this is permanent. We have now completed the Zionist project. Now the entire country is ours. And now we're in the final phase of settler colonialism, which is normalization, to normalize it all. So it stops being a conflict and it begins to be a normal situation. So in other words, what's important here is that the Israeli military security political policy is that of permanent population control. Because even though Israel wants to normalize, the Palestinians can never normalize. When the Palestinians can never say, okay, we lose, or okay, this is a Jewish country, or okay, we give up our national rights. For them, it'll always be occupation and colonialism and oppression and apartheid. So that the problem is how towards the outside world and towards our own Israeli population can we normalize, make everything quiet and acceptable, while at the same time controlling a restless population that has no rights and that can't accept that situation. And without getting into it all, Israel has imposed then on the occupied territory, that I still call an occupied territory, what I call a matrix of control. I've written about it. I'm not going to get into it tonight, but it's a matrix that has to do not only with policies, but also with physical impediments to Palestinians, like checkpoints and walls. And it has to do with types of administration. It's a very complex, but together it's a matrix in that it makes up an entire system of permanent population control, but a system that isn't seen as military. The Israeli military government over the occupied territory is called the civil administration. And as much as possible, I mean, Kafka comes from Prague. Kafka couldn't have dreamed this up. You know, the whole use of administration and zoning and planning and law as mechanisms of political control. In other words, on the surface, they seem normal, routine, civilian, reasonable, which gives Israel then that image of being a peaceful, democratic country, liberal country, but in fact create this whole system of population control. And what I began to finally kind of figure out was that in a way, Israel over Palestine is a microcosm of the global north over the global south. Because we live, all of us, in a neoliberal capitalist system that is closing down on us more and more and more. In other words, you've got this idea of the global north that is like the wall that the Israelis built. Here in the global north, we're building the walls to wall ourselves off from the global south, or from the rest of the world. So the global north that's actually defined physically, and as we know from all the immigration issues, is getting harder to get into. This global north sucks up 73% of the world's income, the world's resources, but it only has 14% of the world's population. Now, this whole system then is becoming more and more unequal and exclusive. 80% of humanity lives on under 2 euros a day. Which means then, and this is an amazing term, I always tell my religious friends, when you go to church or the mosque or the synagogue or wherever you go, this is a theological concept, surplus humanity. This is how the corporations view 80% of the people of this world, including a lot of the young people here. And that is surplus humanity. Simply a human population that's surplus, that isn't needed for the ongoing neoliberal capitalist system, and that has to be controlled. Because if you don't have a job, you don't have a house, and the basics of living, and you're excluded, you're not going to accept that any more than the Palestinians accept occupation, right? In other words, you can't ever normalize poverty, normalize being surplus to the rest of the world. And that's not only in the global south, because as we all know, This movement, the global south, is moving more and more into the global north. You have the indignados in Europe. You've got the Occupy movement in North America. You know, the idea of the 99%, the 1% is a real thing. That's not a slogan. Oxfam came out with a report about 2 years ago that in fact 1% of the world's population owns 50% of the world's resources. So this isn't just some exaggerated slogan. And more the young generation in the global north is being excluded. You know, there's no more job security. Everybody's a McDonald's type worker. You can't get housing. And for young people here tonight, you do not have the expectation of a standard of living that your parents had. We're going down. It's a downward spiral. And as that happens, people don't accept it. People begin to revolt. People begin to be restless. They begin to be disgruntled. And that creates that same kind of a problem for the global capitalist ruling classes that Israel has. How do we control this population permanently under permanent conditions of inequality? This is really the global question for the capitalist system. And you see it in all kinds of ways. I won't get into too much detail, but you know, the whole concept of most wars today are resource wars. You know, because as the resources become scarcer, and of course climate change, it plays a role in all of this as well, it turns out that the most valuable resources in the world are under the poorest countries. So the question becomes, first of all, how do we alienate those resources from the people living on them? And then we take 73% of them into the global north, leaving the rest of the people, including the ones living on those resources, as surplus humanity. These are resource wars. So then that's where I think Israel plays an important role. I'll come into that in a minute. But just let me kind of put this out in a certain way. And one reason, I'll tell you, one reason I wrote the book, I mean, I know nothing about the military, or I knew nothing. I wrote a book about something I know nothing about. I couldn't tell you a tank from a hand grenade, you know, but I began to understand this issue of population control and of inequalities. And I could see, I began to see Israel's global role in this as well. And I began to understand that we on the left, or progressives, however you see yourself, liberal, progressive, left, whatever, we don't know anything about the military, security, police systems. We don't know, and including me, of course. One reason we don't know is because, and this isn't 100%, of course, I would say, I just throw this out as an idea, but I would say something like probably 80%, 70 or 80% of the people on the left are not hard scientists. We come from the social sciences. From the social sciences, the humanities, or the arts. Now, I know somebody here is going to jump up and say, I'm a physicist, or I'm a chemist. I mean, I'm not saying, but for the most part, you can make that correlation. There's been a lot of research on those sorts of things. And so in a way, to the degree that this whole military security area is technical, with technologies and its whole vocabulary, and it's not really something we talk about. It's not on the agenda of the left. I mean, we sometimes demonstrate about drones. That somehow popped up as an issue. We demonstrated against Iraq, at least some of us, you know. Here and there we react to certain things, demonstrations about Gaza. But overall, we don't really relate to this sort of stuff. And I'll tell you, if you take today the military and security and police your police forces, are really one package. They share weapons, they share tactics, they share budgets, they share authority. Together, they make up a $2.5 trillion. Well, you don't have euros, so dollars, euros, whatever it is. When you get into the trillions, it doesn't matter. I won't say it in crowns, but a $2.5 trillion a year industry. So I'm saying to myself, I want to make the world a better place, and I don't know anything about a $2.5 trillion industry? Whoa, that's a pretty big blind spot. So I think it's really one reason I wrote this is to begin to educate. We have to begin to educate ourselves and raise these issues on our agendas, because these are the issues that are probably most affecting us, but the issues in which we're most ignorant and passive. So just to put it in a certain perspective, you know, when we think about war, we think about war. We think about battles and armies and ideologies and countries fighting countries and so on. But those kinds of conventional interstate wars are really a thing of the past. The last major war in which two or more major powers fought each other was Korea, 70-some years ago. That was now, there's been some localized wars, terrible wars. I'm not trying to minimize them, but local wars, Arab-Israeli wars, Iran-Iraq, of course, Russia and Georgia, the Falklands, there's a cute little war. I mean, there are these localized wars going on, sometimes involving states, but not involving major powers. And yet, or maybe one major power, but not more than one. And yet, these are the kinds of wars that our militaries are preparing for. The Pentagon, the European Union, the arms dealers are all dealing in these kinds of weapons to fight those sorts of wars. But those aren't the wars threatening the capitalist system, the ruling classes. Those are the wars the ruling classes make trillions of dollars off of. What threatens them are what we could call securocratic wars, or wars against the people, against us. Securocratic meaning these are wars in which the capitalist system has to secure resources. It has to secure security itself from us. It has to secure, its hegemony over the entire system. It's securocratic in that sense, and we're the enemies. You see? And so wars today, there's two major kinds. One are securocratic wars. We often use the term, in English at least, asymmetric wars. Asymmetric military wars abroad. Afghanistan is probably the main example today of that kind of a war. In which, countries aren't fighting countries, we're fighting networked, non-state actors for the most part. And there's a million terms in English for these, and they're not wars, because wars are supposed to be declared. And the ruling classes want that flexibility to be able to use their weapon systems any way they want to. So they're usually called operations or other things. They're called high-intensity operations, limited war, hybrid war, small wars, irregular wars, armed conflict short of war. How's that for a concept? How's this for a concept? Military operations other than war. All kinds of, and these are terms that are used regularly by the military, together with, of course, counterinsurgency, which is really war against the people in one term, and low-intensity conflicts, dirty wars, population-centric warfare. I mean, there's a lot of terms that are used. The point is that these are wars fought against people, fought against non-state actors for the most part, that are fought by militaries, but also security forces and police forces abroad. At home, here, you also have asymmetric wars, but they're at home, so they're put more into the framework of policing or homeland security. So you have counterterrorism, the war on. So there's always a war on crime. There's a war on immigration, a war on poverty, a war on drugs. The war image is used a lot. And what's important is that it creates a state of permanent emergency. It leads to what we call a security state. Whenever you have a crisis, a flood, a war, some natural disaster, the state can often declare a national emergency, meaning that the normal processes of courts and your democratic rights and civil rights are suspended for a while because it's an emergency. It's a crisis, and we have to act faster than what the Constitution allows, or the law allows, or the court allows, and so on. But what's happened after 9/11 is that countries in the West, especially, are now getting into a state of permanent emergency. The United States lives under the Patriot Act since 2001, which suspends many democratic rights that people have in the United States, including reading a library book without the government knowing which book you're reading. France is changing its constitution to allow for a state of permanent emergency. So this allows the rise of a security state, and that leads to the rise of militarized police all over the world. So it's interesting what's happening, and that is that outside in these types of asymmetrical wars abroad, our armies are being policified, made to be like police. So the United States is not really fighting a war in Afghanistan, it's policing Afghanistan, it's policing Iraq, it's policing Somalia. These are police, and which is accurate because actually the capitalist system is policing all of us. So our armies are becoming like police forces, and at the same time at home, our police forces are becoming like armies. Because our police are getting the weapons that militaries normally have and the authority. So what we have under transnational capitalism is what we call an everywhere war. And everywhere, no longer wars of battlefields and those kinds of wars that are defined geographically, but what the military and the police both use are concepts like battle space. So Prague is as much a part of the global battle space as Afghanistan is. These are everywhere wars in which military operations, counterinsurgency wars against the people, and all these sorts of framings, governmentality, are all linked together in order to pacify us. This is an important term, pacification, to pacify us. Now, I don't know, that's not a term that translates well. I don't know in Czech if you have a term like that. But to pacify means to render a population so that they're unable to resist anymore. They can't resist anything. So Israel's goal is to pacify the Palestinians. It's not going to beat them. They're not going to accept as normal occupation, but they can be pacified, which will allow permanent population control. And pacification is a term we should be, see, we're using the wrong languages because we use the language of security. We use their language, and that's what locks us into their logic. So, of course you want to be secure. Everybody wants to be secure, right? And you hear security and go to the airport, go all over, you're always hearing about security. And of course, Israel, that's Israel's key word. But the term security hides political agendas. Because it's a problem-less term. Security is security. It's common sense. We want security. We want our government to give us security. We're happy to see a policeman because he's going to give us security. What if we replaced the term pacification for the term security? So I want to be secure. Great. Do I want to be pacified? Well, wait a minute now. That's a whole different... Now, all of a sudden, questions are raising that the word security doesn't raise. And then there's questions that come up like, who wants to pacify me? Who wants to pacify me? Why are they pacifying me? How are they pacifying me? And all of a sudden, you begin to ask critical questions that the word security closed down and didn't allow you to answer. So this is the bottom line of capitalist of the capitalist system, is to pacify us. And in this, Israel plays a key role. Now, I'm not saying Israel's the only actor. I don't want to pretend that Israel is Israel's a small actor. But it's very important to Israel because it's probably the country, maybe with China, that is the most experienced and sophisticated in terms of population control. Not in terms of big warfare. Israel doesn't have a Pentagon. It doesn't have an army like Europe has, or the US has, or Russia has. But it has the experience in wars against the people, in population control. And I just want to just give a couple examples of what I mean. So what I'm trying to argue then is that in a way, you might say that, just to go back, that this, Israel's a small country, although it has a very sophisticated military. It's the 6th or 7th largest arms exporter in the world. But this is Israel's niche. Securocratic wars abroad and at home. Not this. Israel participates in conventional wars, and it has some very important technologies that the Pentagon uses and Europe uses and so on. But Israel, in fact, has its niche in this kind of asymmetrical war. And just to go back, I forgot to put this slide in. And here you begin to see Israel's global reach. I would argue, and this sounds weird, but I'll argue it anyway, that Israel has a more global reach in terms not just of military, but more important in terms of military too, but in terms of security and police control than the United States does. The United States has maybe 180 bases throughout the world. But these are bases that are fairly self-contained. An American Air Force base has airplanes and McDonald's. And that's pretty much where they stay, and they fly in and out, and they don't have a great impact on the society where they are. Israel doesn't have bases. Or let me say they have two bases, both in Muslim countries. Israel has one very important base, a military, but also where they launch their rockets into space to set up their spy satellites in Azerbaijan. And Azerbaijan is important because it overlooks Iran. So it's a great takeoff place if you want to attack Iran. And Israel also has bases in islands off Eritrea. It has very close ties to Eritrea, with certain, I won't get into this, except to note that 25% of the Israeli arms trade is to Sub-Saharan Africa. So that Israel has a certain military reach, but Israel will train your security forces. Israel will train your local police. Israel trains the American police. Israel also trains, by the way, the Czech National Police. So that Israel, in a way, that has relations with almost every country in the world. Israel has military security relations with countries it doesn't have diplomatic relations with, like Saudi Arabia, like Iran in certain areas, in other countries. So that, in a way, this military security thing bypasses ideologies. And of course, Israel has very strong ties to every country in Europe. In fact, the new European drone, which is called the Watchkeeper, is an Israeli drone. Elbit Systems has a 51% share in the European drone that's being developed in your name and deployed in your name, the Watchkeeper drone, plus a lot of other technologies with virtually every European country. But what's interesting is, look, little Israel, how many people are in the Czech Republic? What's your population? How many? 10 million. So Israel's 8.5. So we're smaller than you are. And yet, Israel is the number 2 or 3 arms supplier to China after Russia. Now that's amazing, because if Israel was selling big, expensive equipment, battleships and jet airplanes and big major weapon systems, missiles, you could understand how it would sell enough to be number 2. But it doesn't. It sells little things. It sells navigation equipment, laser weapons, very specialized targeting systems, surveillance systems, all sorts of things that have to do much more with security and what are called the avionics, the electronics of military systems. If you can sell those little things to China and still be number 2 or 3, it means your penetration into China is very deep, including, I would say, the repression of the Uyghurs, and a lot of that security surveillance technology. But look, Israel is also the number 3 or 4 largest arms supplier to India. I mean, India loves Israel now. India is Israel's largest customer for arms these days. And everywhere else. I mean, I could go give you 174. In other words, what Israel is doing is supplying these technologies on 2 levels. One is, if you go country by country by country, you can explain how Israel is helping the ruling classes and the governments to stay in power against their restless populations. In some places, it's more military. In some places, it's more police, like in the United States, for example. In some places, it's more different. The constellations vary. But Israel is the go-to place for every country that's having problems with populations, whether they're terrorists or seen as terrorists, or they're restless, or they're whatever. But on a bigger level, again, you've got that whole global neoliberal capitalist system that we all live in. And as it's closing down, the entire world needs permanent population control. And that's the niche, again, that Israel fills. Just to go back to to go back here again. This is the niche then that Israel fills globally and also in every country. So let's just take just a couple examples. Fortified borders. I mean, Israel has a pretty famous wall. The wall that Israel's built in the occupied territory, the Palestinian territory, is 5 times longer than the Berlin Wall was, and it's more than twice as high as the Berlin Wall was. And yet, Israel gets away with it, unlike East Germany, you see? And it's not only, of course, the wall and everything else, but I'll show you in a minute, there's other parts of the wall as well. Well, what's Europe doing? Europe is fortifying its borders. And Israel is very involved in the European project of sealing itself off from immigrants, and from each other sometimes. So this whole kind of a security system of fortified borders, which includes surveillance systems, and it includes smart fences. You see, it's not only walls, but these they have sensors, that are smart rather than big. Of course, Elbit Systems is involved with the American wall that's being built against Mexico, and so on. So this is a very graphic example of an occupation technology that's being exported by Israel into Europe, including autonomous shooting weapon stations like this in Gaza. In other words, these are actually illegal in the world. Israel uses them, they're illegal, because it's illegal to use autonomous systems. It's illegal still in the world to use weapon systems that are not under human control. But Israel does that. In other words, these are weapon systems that run on algorithms. And in fact, some of the drones that are being flown today are using algorithms as well. You put in an algorithm what the enemy looks like, what he or she wears, height, how many are in a group, what kind of trucks they drive, where they'd be found, this and that. Put the algorithms in, and these guns, there's a whole buffer area into Gaza, and the guns will shoot automatically without human control. You also have guns like these, stations like these, that have soldiers in Tel Aviv that are watching on TV screens. For example, with the March on Gaza, if you want to be more specific and focus in, you can do that. But normally, these are simply guns that fire automatically according to algorithms. Of course, all the checkpoints. There are about 600 checkpoints in the West Bank. Israel doesn't need that for security. And that's what gives me the idea that the occupation is a laboratory. It's not a genuine occupation because Israel's afraid of Palestinians and they constitute an existential threat to Israel. There is no military or security threat from Palestinians whatsoever. And in fact, Israel could easily even resolve everything politically if it wanted to. But intentionally, it keeps the occupation in a state of certain controlled unrest in order to test and perfect its weapon systems. In other words, if you have a laboratory of millions of people that you can do anything you want to them with no international oversight, that's a tremendous resource. And if you see, and I did this, you can look it up. You look up Israeli weapons companies. This isn't secret. They're trying to sell the weapons. Many weapon systems, if you look on the internet, will say, this is a certain laser mission, combat proven in Gaza, or tested in Gaza, or combat tested. In other words, what gives Israeli weapon systems an edge in the market is that they're actually used and perfected on Palestinians. They're not just perfected in some laboratory in Texas and then sold. So that in a sense, Israel does not need the occupation for political or security reasons. It needs it because it's that laboratory. So you've got 600 checkpoints. Why do you need 600 checkpoints to control Palestinians? And they're not checkpoints between the West Bank and Israel. They're checkpoints deep inside the West Bank that interfere with Palestinian internal movement. So there really is no security. The vast majority of the wall that we showed doesn't separate Israelis from Palestinians. It separates Palestinians from Palestinians. It's built inside Palestinian communities. So security is not the reason for these kinds of arrangements. Well, here you've got checkpoints that have been privatized. So all these checkpoints have Israeli security companies, surveillance companies, testing their goods, their technologies. So, for example, one of the major systems is what's called a company called Nice Systems. How's that for a name? that has a totalizing system. Glasgow in Scotland just bought it. Some cities in India have just bought it, in which it's really total control. Because what Israel's specializing in as well, not alone, but certainly as a specialty, is facial recognition, body recognition, voice recognition, digitalized systems that really build a database on every single one of us. And these systems are being sold to cities around the world. All right. One other, I'll end in a minute. One other technology that you can see comes out of the occupation are drones. Israel produces 60% of the world's drones, both for surveillance and militarized, weaponized. And what's interesting is most drones are sold to police forces today, not to armies. Now, why? Why Israel? Drone technology has been known. There were drones in World War II, primitive drones, but they were drones. The technology was fairly developed in the 1970s. But you see, it depends on the war you're fighting. The United States could have developed drones. But drones in conventional war are stupid weapons. Because what does a drone do? It hangs in the sky. That's the whole point of the drone. It hangs there for days and weeks and months, just surveying, sometimes attacking maybe, but that's what it does. Well, in a conventional war against a country that has an air force, you can shoot it down. It's a sitting duck, we say in English. I know you like ducks in the Czech Republic. It's a sitting duck. Well, so the United States is saying, why would we invest money in an airplane that you can shoot down? So they never got into it. But Israel was fighting another kind of war. Israel was fighting a war against the people, against the Palestinian people, and they don't have missiles. They don't have an air force. And so they couldn't get to the drones. And these were perfect kinds of weapons against the people. We, sitting in this room, don't have an air force. We can't shoot down the police drones that are above us. And that's, you see the direct relationship between the kind of war you perceive and the kinds of technologies that you develop, which is why Israeli technologies of control are more developed than that of the United States and most other countries. But drones aren't just big airplanes. Israel's developing mini drones. You know, the whole idea of mimicking butterflies, mimicking birds, insects, and robotic drones. How's this for a drone? Cute, right? Now these are cameras that are very sophisticated cameras. So this is a spy plane, basically, on your fingertip. But look at this. This is a vial. It could be used for poisons. Another technology that Israel is one of the world's leaders in is nanotechnology, which is probably the most dangerous technology in the world. You think of a nano is a billionth of a meter. Now imagine military weapon systems, a billion of a meter big. I'm not going to get into the whole nano issue, but China, Israel, Germany, and the United States are investing more in nano weapon systems today than in any other kind of weapon system. So we're all concerned about nuclear war. These are much more powerful than nuclear weapons because, for example, you can nanoize, you can take a disease like anthrax or a disease that has no antidote, and you can nanoize it. So a vial this size, if you injected this into a water supply, you could kill 1 million people. This cute little insect drone is a weapon of mass destruction, probably more so than a nuclear bomb. But it's not on our agenda, it's not on our radar. We're not really aware of these technologies, right? Because they're really not something that we're talking about or know very much about. Nanotechnologies. And then, of course, you have policing coming, through police forces into our cities, because our cities are your community is a part of the global battle space. And here, I won't get into it again, but here there's a whole issue of pacification and the rise of the security state. That you get this paranoia over security, and everybody's looking around for who the latest threat is. And so you militarize the police, and you declare a state of exception, and then repressive laws and regulations are enacted that couldn't be enacted in normal times. We're not in normal times anymore. And police power is boosted, legal process is weakened. You get this logic of security. So the point of pacification isn't to pacify us, it's that we pacify ourselves. So when we go to the airport, nobody has to ask us to take off our shoes and take off our belts and take our computers out of the... Why do you take your computer out of the computer case? Well, the 21st century, there's no technology that can see through a computer case. It's simply to keep that fear and that obedience going. And we voluntarily surrender to that. We joke around with the security people. We do it routinely. We're pacifying ourselves. That's the brilliance of pacification. You create a situation in which, in the end, we internalize the securocratic logic, and they don't have to tell us what to do. They don't have to repress us. They don't have to do what Israel does, that we do it to ourselves. And that, of course, then keeps this whole system going. But there's always the issue of violence, because pacification is never complete, or it's a process. So, for example, just to show you policing type of weapons for a second, this is the Uzi submachine gun. It's the most famous submachine gun in the world, the Israeli Uzi. The mafias love it. It's in movies all the time. But what Israel's done now is, it was a submachine gun that you held like this. Now Israel's made the Uzi for police forces. So it's more like a revolver. So the next time you're pulled over by a traffic cop, he could pull an Uzi. Now that might be less of an issue in the Czech Republic, but believe me, in Missouri, in the United States, that's a real issue, especially if you're black. So, again, the coming together of the military and police forces, plus all kinds of technologies of repression, many of which are sold as non-lethal. Crowd control, these kinds of sprays that Israel is one of the leaders in these kinds of non-lethal crowd control technologies, again, because of Palestinians. So, all right, so the question is, so what? Okay, so fine. So what? And what I think we have to do as the left, on the left here, is we have to be more aware of these issues. We have to really be sensitive, because we are being pacified. And we have to begin to be much more proactive in terms of not only rejecting the hegemony of corporate capitalism and population control and pacification and securitization, all this other stuff we've talked about, but we have to be much more proactive in beginning to articulate what a new global system would be like. And that we're not doing. So that on the one hand, we're not being even reactive enough, because we're not perceiving the real threats that are out there to us. And on the other hand, we're not offering anything to people. So, war against the people. We have some time for discussion.
So maybe I would ask, maybe it will sound like a naive question or asking for the conspiracy answer, but I'm still thinking, like, how this happened. I mean, of course, the conflict or the problem there, the situation is lasting for 70 years. It's time enough to train, to try everything. Right. But it still seemed to me that there should be money behind it, But still, I mean, why Israel? It's not the only conflict place in the world. So what make the situation there special?
Well, I did have a slide about that, but okay, I'll go back to. I think what makes Israel special, it's true. I mean, I tried to say that Israel's not the only country, certainly dealing in these technologies and so on, but it's in this pivotal. I had this slide with all the blue circles. It's in a certain pivotal position, because Israel is in, for the last 125 years, as a colonial power. It's in a settler colonial power. It's in a war against the people, against the Palestinians. So this is an ongoing colonial conflict that still is going on. So in other words, it's an old conflict. It's been going on for generations already, but it's still going on. It isn't like Europe that had colonies, until the 1960s, and then since then, no. So in other words, the technologies that have developed and the tactics that have developed over the last years are tactics that other countries haven't. The United States didn't do very well in Vietnam and Afghanistan because they're not used to fighting those kinds of wars. And on the other hand, Israel is also very skilled, just real quick, Israel is also very skilled, you see, in terms of, Israel has, it's fought 5 or 6 conventional wars, real wars. So it's got that military technology, but it's also fought the Palestinians for the last 100 and some years. But at the same time, Israel has high-tech weapons. It's very sophisticated in its technology. It's not like there's other countries that have been involved in counterinsurgency that haven't used the technology. The American technology in Vietnam for its pacification campaigns was extremely primitive. Even in Afghanistan, in Iraq, they had Petraeus develop things like, they were either search and destroy missions, all you needed was arms and to kill everybody, or winning hearts and minds, that kind of thing, with education. The Americans did not use very sophisticated technologies of population control in their wars, like Israel has, because the Americans always thought, and other colonial powers, that we're going to be out someday. You see, and we're not going to be there permanently. So that whole thing of permanence, I think, is a key thing, and the fact that Israel then is highly sophisticated in terms of modern weapons. Israel has. It's really the only country in the world that has privileged access to American military technology. So, the Americans share with Israel technologies that it doesn't share with the Europeans or anybody else. So that gives, so Israel in a sense is a laboratory for the United States as well. And then, of course, Israel works not just with the major powers, but like I said, with local hegemons in every country in the world pretty much. So that each of these is not unique to Israel. But when you begin to put them together like this over the last century, then Israel really has a unique position as a specialist in what's sometimes called hybrid warfare. So I think that's one reason why Israel is it's simply the kind of warfare that it's specialized in and continues to in a way that no other country has been involved, I think.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. I want to thank you for this lecture. I really appreciate it. A lot of information and thank you very much. But how you
that
can...
was a but.
how you can explain with all this technology, with all this tactic, with all this, how you can explain the ability of Palestinians to prevent and to do this military operation in Gaza or West Bank? How you can explain the ability of the Palestinians to?
Well, these technologies aren't complete. There's a delicate balance, and I'm always trying to find that balance. Because on the one hand, These are all technologies that are being developed. So there's a certain learning curve. So the fact that we're not very successful today doesn't mean we're not going to be successful in 5 years or 10. You know, these technologies are being perfected more and more on the one hand. But on the other hand, there's always spaces of resistance. The Palestinians have been great at this, but also other peoples have always found, ways of tackling these high-tech. That's the danger of high-tech solutions, is that they become vulnerable to primitive responses. The airplanes, commercial airplanes flying into the World Trade Center. I mean, who would have expected that? In other words, in a way, the asymmetrical warfare can give certain advantages to the weaker power, because they have to be more creative in some ways. And I think you get into a high-tech logic where you begin to think it's so powerful and so totalizing that you miss all of a sudden ways that people. Now, for example, there's masks that certain groups have developed that confound facial recognition. So in the UK, for example, it's the most densely CCTV'd country in the world, where everybody's on facial recognition all the time. Well, there's certain kinds of, it's not exactly a mask, because you're not allowed, it's illegal to cover your face. That's one reason why you've got now these laws against veiled women and so on, because that confounds although you can pick up eyes and things like that. So there's technologies today, almost like makeup, that you can put on that confound facial recognition. It doesn't work on your face, and the police can't pick it up. So, there's always that cat and mouse game going on. So on the one hand, I don't want to say that they're going to win. I mean, if I said that, I wouldn't be resisting myself. I think we can resist. We have to be aware of it, and we have to find all kinds of ways to resist. But on the other hand, I don't want us to fall into this easy thing about, well, freedom always wins or justice always wins, and minimize this technology as well. This technology is there, and it's very totalizing, and I think we have to deal with it. So that and I think part of our challenge is, how do you resist totalizing technologies that see everything and know everything and hear everything? That's for example, in the NICE systems that I mentioned, just real quick, they say on their website, this is part of their selling. What's the greatest threat to a security state? They want all states to become security states. Meaning you could be a democracy, but that's second to security. Security trumps, if you want to use that term. Security trumps democracy. Well, the three greatest threats to a security state that these security systems try to eliminate are states of exception. In other words, for example, a demonstration, or anything that's unusual, can be resistance, or that can get away with something or not be followed. People of exception. Anybody that's taller than usual, anybody that's fatter than usual, anybody that's smarter than usual. And that's what these systems pick up. All these surveillance systems, they pick up everything. But they focus very much on traits that are not normal. However, the algorithm defines normal, you see? And so they're able, and sometimes it means you hang around a particular street corner more than most people do. Or you're in groups of 4 or 5 people more than normal people are. Or you're in a particular part of town, or you drive a certain kind of car that's sort of like the Taliban drive white Toyota pickup trucks. So if you drive a white pickup truck, it's an exception, sort of. So all these things are picked up, and spaces of exception, places that aren't surveyed. The greatest threat to the security state are places where there aren't cameras. We don't know in other words, pacification means we have to know everything that's going on everywhere all the time. That's the goal. And these systems can get fairly close to that. So one of the questions, it's an open question, I don't have an answer, I don't know if there is an answer. How do you resist those kinds of systems? And the Palestinians have probably been one of the most creative and ingenious peoples that have done that. I mean, Israel has not been able to pass. Look, the 6-Day War, Israel defeated 6 Arab countries. It's never been able to defeat Gaza or pacify Gaza. So apparently, resistance is possible, even to a specialized security state like Israel. The cost might be high, but there's things that we can learn from Palestinian resistance, certainly, that we could apply to our own lives. In the back, there was a...
In the back, sir, please.
As a conclusion of your presentation, that we should be aware of all these tools, Israeli tools, and we should just define the new global system. But when we talk about we are just civil society, and we are facing military tools, we are facing international relations, we are a system, we are facing big countries.
That's right.
I mean, how our awareness can help these Palestinians, how can it change things? I mean, if we really need to change some stuff, okay, if we think as it is normally going on the international system, we should either go by NGOs, but NGOs, okay, they're going to do demonstrations. They cannot do demonstrations in Europe because everybody will call them Zionists and anti-Semites, and everybody will just call them by their history, and also European, and also for sure UK helped Jews to go outside Europe. Okay, some approaches, some historians said that, okay, UK was also the mind of all of these colonialism idea. So if we talk about US, what can NGOs do in US? Oh, nothing, because lobbies will definitely stop it. What can Arab people do? Oh, nothing, because they are not even democracies and people that not even are allowed to speak. And if we think about another international institution, we will find UN. We will sign a petition for UN, but who controls UN? Who gives money for UN? Okay, just the big powers. So what can we do? Technically, we can just talk about that. We can really just no, but it's really to talk about that. And also, I do think that all these donations of the international institutions are really just leaving this conflict cold and not even helping the conflict to evolve. If we just set the conflict actors on the table and just keep US and all EU outside the conflict, maybe they will achieve a point, but they can't, because EU and US are really helping Israel, and they are the ones who kept it like this. Israel cannot just be built from nowhere.
Yes.
I mean, just not Jews will be like, oh, let's go to Palestine, or let's go to another city in Africa. I mean, in the beginning it was maybe another country in Africa, or maybe Palestine. Then they found out, oh, Holy Land in Palestine. But who's really just doing all this mindset of who is really helping in all this? Not the people. There are states, institutions, people states who are powerful, have tools, states who are powerful militarily, ideologically, economically. We cannot be them. I mean,
Well, I mean, your question is actually the question that we should all be asking. We should map out. That's what I've been trying to do here to some degree. Map out who's, that's what Wallerstein did partly and others. Map out who actually runs the, it's not a machine. I mean, people run this world system. And there's institutions, and there's ruling classes, and there's sources of power, and there's sources of economic power, and you can map it out, and then to begin to develop a strategy. of how to deal with it. Now, what's true is that governments are not our friends. They're not on our side. And one of the problems that we face, certainly the Palestinians face, is that we've all been NGO-ified. In other words, rather than activist groups or resistance groups or revolutionary groups today, everybody's an NGO. And that's really weakened as civil society. So that's another form of pacification, in a way, giving to all, so we become all dependent on budgets. There's a lot of things, but I think, the concept that I'm trying to deal with here, just to create a discussion around it, is what I call global Palestine. What I'm saying is, let's learn from this microcosm of Israel over Palestine and apply it outside, to our lives. For example, the BDS movement. You see, now, I think BDS is a good movement, but it should focus more on what's happening here. There are Czech universities, I'm sure, that have relations to the Technion, which is Israel's polytechnic that develops these robotic nano weapons. And there's research is done between Czech scientists and Israelis. There are probably there are Czech companies that work with Israeli companies. Your police is being trained by Israel to some degree. So BDS shouldn't only be, let's boycott Caterpillar because they build bulldozers to demolish Palestinian homes, but we should bring it home. The occupation is here. And the same technologies that are being used to pacify Palestinians. The message of Gaza for me, that I try to get out to people, is the people of Gaza are the guinea pigs. Israel's not developing these weapon systems, laser missiles, and infrared surveillance systems, and all the weapons it uses in Gaza. And in my book, I show weapons that are used for the first time in Gaza to really show that it's a laboratory. They're not using these weapons to control Palestinians. The Palestinians in Gaza are not, again, any kind of security threat to Israel. They're using them to test them and to perfect them in Gaza. But the end users, the ones that actually are you guys. Israel the point isn't to use these weapons on the Palestinians. The point is to sell them, to use them as part of Israeli security politics. So these weapon systems get out to your police forces, they get out to your militaries, they get out into your communities. So one of the messages of the global Palestine movement should be that the occupation is here in Prague. Whoa, all of a sudden, in other words, what I try to say is, as your militaries and police forces here are being Israelized, you are being Palestinianized. Don't think the Palestinians are only the Palestinians. Palestinians, in a wider sense, are anybody that's living under systems and weapon systems and pacification systems that begin on Palestinians, but then are spread out to other places. Now, this is our dilemma. So now the question is, how do we resist? How do we change policy? How do we, and I don't think there's an answer. I can't get up and give an answer. I think this is part of a whole strategy that we have to have as the left, and we're not having it. That's part of the problem. We're not. We're not dealing with this. So I'm basically the messenger who's raising these issues, trying to show the global context that we're in, what's happening to us, with the hope that we'll begin to be like Palestinians and begin to be more actively resisting these systems and trying to figure out the Palestinians are trying to figure out how do we deal with these high-tech systems, and they've had some successes, quite a few successes actually. Well, maybe we have to replicate those things in our own situations.
I think here, Darren.
Yeah, just a small thing. Part of Israel's brand or image is as a startup nation. There's even a book called The Startup Nation. How much of this startup industry high-tech industry in Israel is this.
90%. I mean, that's what Naomi Klein writes about this as well, actually. It's easy to be a startup nation when your government and military are feeding you the technologies. So, for example, common things, your firewall in your computer that protects all our computers against viruses, it's an Israeli company called Checkpoint that developed it. And these are all graduates of what's called Unit 8200, which is probably the most sophisticated cyber warfare security surveillance unit in the Israeli army, all of whom go into high-tech industry. I mean, it's a direct kind of a tie. So that, through the Technion, the Weizmann Institute, and so on, it's a direct channel from the military and the military technologies. Israel it has private industry, but not private industry in the sense that a capitalist country has. Israel's private industries are really quasi-public, both military and also systems, more business-like systems. So moving back and forth between the army in terms of personnel, army and companies, but also the technologies. Because if you're coming out of the army, you've got security clearances, you've got contacts, and the army actually asks corporations, they say, we have to have this kind of technology, develop it for us. And then, of course, you can parlay that technology into a commercial application. So it's a very direct, almost across the board, tie between the military and being a startup nation, for sure.
There was another question.
I want to ask you to say when we heard from you tonight, what the technology of Israel, if we will show us for our people, for the Palestinians, it means that we have no hope to fight against the technology of Israel. But when we see in Gaza each Friday what happens, and in Lebanon also these days, how the people were with just very simple technology, with the balloon and the fire, or with the tunnels.
That's right.
To go to they appear on the other side to Israel. Because they have the confidence, the Palestinians. The ability is not too much, but they have the confidence that one day will win. And I hope that this day is not too far from us.
Right. No. Amen. What do you say to that? But of course, resistance is important, but it has to be tied to a political program as well. In other words, you're not going to win just through resistance. You have to win by tying resistance to a political program and then making it so costly for the oppressor that they finally give into a political program. And that's something we're missing today. That's going to be my talk tomorrow night. And that is that we're missing an end game today. The two-state solution is gone. The Palestinians have not articulated yet, I'm part of a movement to do that, what the alternative to the two-state is, which I think is one democratic state. So that we can resist and we can do BDS. BDS, for example, as much as we support BDS, boycotts, divestment, sanctions, that movement, it has no political program attached to it. It's not clear why we're BDSing exactly. So that I think, in the absence of a political program, resistance keeps the thing alive, but you can't prevail unless you have something that you're fighting for. I mean, besides freedom and end the occupation and these kinds of slogans, you have to have a real program that you can bring into the political arena and say, these are our demands in a concrete sort of a way. And I think it's the same globally. I think I don't know, the left, I don't know who to talk about, but we who want to resist, and I think Actually, people who are conservative should be just as concerned. I mean, their kids are also don't have jobs and houses. It's not like they're doing much better than anybody else. But, you know, we have to think about not just resisting, although resisting is an issue. How do you resist a totalizing kind of a system? But to what end? What do we want? And that's where I'm, you know, we haven't talked about that. You know, what is the new system we want to, what's our political program? Is it socialism? Or maybe an updated socialism? Is it, David Harvey talks about revolutionary humanism. Other people talk about life-centric hegemony. I mean, there's all kinds of weird and not so weird, interesting ideas out there. But they're just very vague ideas. We haven't, unlike the capitalist ruling classes that know exactly what they want with neoliberalism, we don't have an alternative program. So I think it's true for Palestinians and for the rest of us, the Palestinianized, and that is that without a political program, we can't, our resistance isn't going to prevail. So there's a lesson in there, I guess.
Please.
I have a question. Actually, like, what is, for you, the line between security and pacification? Because I really don't like the argument like about the airport security, because for me it's still a security, it's not pacification. And it's like absolutely logical that as like the security threats have evolved, that also the technology have evolved. So for me, like I see it as normal, like you cannot find like these hybrid wars and disinformation with conventional warfare. It's not really possible. And also like, I would ask, okay, like the common people have like usual problems. They don't have, I don't know, like lack of jobs, poverty. And if you have like the existential problems, you cannot really fight this.
Yeah, that's right.
Like the
You're
whole
so concerned with
system.
surviving that you don't have this.
So I mean, I don't know, like even without this, like how would this help like the common people, or like I don't know, to how would this improve normal life people?
Well, you know, I think, I mean, there are legitimate security concerns. I mean, you know, I'm not saying that it's all just a fantasy. I mean, there are threats, but it begins to get into the level of pacification when it becomes when the fear and paranoia begin to be so what's the word, universal or common in society that you know it's already disconnected from actual threats. The Pentagon uses a term for training the military and police in the United States. It's called the Universal Adversary, because you've got to prepare for everything, from terrorists to criminals to one of the definitions of the Universal Adversary that the Pentagon has is disgruntled workers. Workers that are not satisfied, that aren't happy in their jobs, or not making enough. That's seen as a national security threat. So you see, that's where the security begins to move over into a political agenda. When you know, workers are seen, they are a security threat. You know, but they're not a security threat in that in the sense that we mean security.
Well, they say insider threat. That's the most popular word for this, where they're talking about people leaking evidence of their criminal activity, and that's considered like an insider threat.
Yeah, but I don't think there's an inside-outside. I think they all...
Yeah, but I'm talking using their language. I'm not saying necessarily that, you know, they're rational.
Right.
So that's where, in other words, you get into this what I call securocratic logic. And that is that you begin to see the world in a very paranoid kind of a way. Everything's a threat. And then, that's why, you know, I mean, if you talk about an actual security, let's say there's an actual warning of a terrorist that wants to knock down an airplane. Well, if I use the word pacification, that doesn't work, because it really is a security threat. But if I'm talking about a routine thing in which we all take our computers out of the bags and we do this, and we hear it 100 times a day. If you see something, if you see something, say something, report it to the police, and that begins to get into our minds. That's not related to any particular threat. It's just the whole world is a threat like that. Then the term pacification does begin to mean something.
But then don't you think that like your response to it is like always also paranoid? That like, I mean, okay, you see the security threats everywhere, but then on the other side you see like the pacification everywhere.
Well, no, I'm saying if it works, then it's not a paranoid thing. It's not you know, if it doesn't work, I mean, if there's a real threat, I mean, if there's a criminal outside and the police say he's just shot 3 people and don't get out of the building, I'm not going to call that pacification. You see, but in other words, the word pacification is useful because it does, but on the other hand, if people are saying, don't go outside after 9 because it's too dangerous or something, something's going on. Why do they want us to be at home at 9 or something? And then we begin. In other words, we have to use our critical abilities. And we can't really use our critical abilities if we don't understand the system and the interests. And again, the advantage of the idea of pacification is it exposes the fact security is not a neutral term. It's not a technical term. There's really security. But really security conceals interests. Again, why do we take our computers out of the bag? And if there's not a good, real security reason, then something else is going on. And that's what the critical thing brings out. The fact that under security, it's a term that's a very good pacification term because it's something that you simply accept. And in a way, you're right. There's no way to objectively analyze it. Is it really secure? It isn't, partly because everything's in secret. So why it's security, they're not going to tell us, right? Because it's a secret. So that, the whole paranoid thing becomes even stronger in a way. We're not able to evaluate whether it's a genuine security threat or just a form of manipulation.
I think we have time for 1 or 2 questions, so please.
I would like to ask a question about the house demolitions that you mentioned briefly at the very beginning.
Right. I'm going to talk about more tomorrow.
Okay, so it's not a good time.
No, go ahead.
Okay, I'd like to ask you if you could explain or clarify the provisions of the Israeli domestic laws that are relevant to the house demolitions, and also to give us some examples of case law, in other words, to explain how and why it works and what are the reasons that Israel does it.
All right, I'll get into that more tomorrow night. But just in a word about demolitions and the law, see what Israel's done is it's zoned, again, it's zoning, planning, law, and so on. So Israel has zoned, just as an example, almost the entire West Bank, not quite this part, but 72% of the West Bank has been zoned by Israel as agricultural land. Now, most of it isn't agricultural land. As a matter of fact, this is what we call the Judean desert. This is where Jesus went into the wilderness after the resurrection. I mean, it's not agricultural land. There are some agricultural areas, but not this whole area. Anyway, it's zoned as agricultural land. And so Palestinians can own land. But if you come to but in area C, which is all the areas, in other words, the brown areas A and B are under Palestinian Authority control. But the 62% of the West Bank that's on the gray areas and these pink areas that are the settlement blocks, it's all Israeli control. So that in area C, you can own land, and then you have to come to the Israeli civil administration. So it's another trick. And you apply for a permit. And this is where it's like Kafka, because there's a window, and there's a clerk, and there's a form, you fill out the form, and you pay a fee, and you have to do this. You know, but you're not going to get the permit, because they'll come back and they'll say it's agricultural land. You see? So overall, I mean, then there's other things that come in sometimes, like what just happened a couple of weeks ago, when Israel demolished those 70 homes in Area A by Jerusalem that's under Palestinian Authority control. Israel agrees it's under Palestinian Authority control, and they still demolished for security reasons, because they were built too close to the wall that was built illegally in Palestinian area. So there's other things, but overall, let's say, just simply, it's because all this has been zoned as agricultural land. And that's it. And Israel says, look, it applies to everybody. It doesn't apply just, there's no law that says Arabs can't build. Nothing like that. You know, it's a military order, actually. It's not case law either, because the West Bank is run by military, or about 2,000 military orders, because according to the 14th Geneva Convention, you're not allowed to apply your legal system to occupied territory, so they made up a new legal system that's military orders. At any rate, nobody can build in agricultural land, okay, except who sits on the planning committee? Who decides the zoning? The civil administration. Well, there's no Palestinians in the civil administration, obviously. It's a military government. So when you want to build a settlement, you know, one of these blue dots for 50,000 Israelis on the same agricultural land, you simply rezone from agriculture to residential, and you build legally. Well, you're not going to rezone land for Palestinians. You see, and that's where this legal trick comes in, and that is, it doesn't discriminate on surface between populations, but de facto, you know, because the planning committees are all Israeli, they fulfill obviously Israeli political intentions. So that just, and then of course, so what happens then is, you know, this is now 3 generations that you can't build. Well, you have children. Your children have children. They have to live somewhere. You know, so you're forced in the end to build illegally. You have to build illegally because you can't build legally. There's no way to get a building permit. And by the way, to apply for a building permit that you're not going to get, to apply can cost 50 or 60,000 euros, because you've got to get a surveyor, and you have to have maps, and you have to, and not only that, but you know, you have to pay for all the infrastructure, because Israel doesn't bring the infrastructure you like it does to settlements. So you have to pay meter by meter for the water system, the electrical system, for the phones. It turns out to be tens of thousands of euros for people that, you know, make 500 euros a month. 70% of the Palestinians live under the poverty line in the West Bank. So obviously they can't, even if they could conceivably get a permit, they couldn't afford the permits. And there's another, I won't get into the whole thing, we'll talk more, but there's all kinds of twists to this, because who does get a permit? Collaborators. That's one of the ways in which Israel sweetens the thing to be a collaborator. You want a house for your kids? No problem. You know, if you collaborate. So even if you're a normal person, and maybe, you know, you're living in an area, and maybe you have some connections and this, and you have some money, that maybe you could get a permit legally, you're not going to apply, because if you actually got the permit, all your neighbors are going to suspect that you're a collaborator. So you see, it's a whole very complex system at work. So in the end, you build without a permit, and you have a demolition order. And then they can come at any time to demolish your home. And they've demolished about 55,000 homes since 1967. So that's, tomorrow we'll talk about more of that policy.
Take it like an invitation to come tomorrow to Hybernska. Do maybe one last question, or otherwise I would just...
One question. What do you think about the technology of military technology of Iran and Hezbollah? on the other side.
Yeah, yeah. No, the question about the Iranian and Hezbollah technology.
Yesterday's letter of Nasrallah to Israel.
Well, Nasrallah had some success in 2006 against Israel. Again, you have to look at things in context. I think, again, there's like I say, I think what Hezbollah has been very good at is identifying those areas of weakness in this high-tech. For example, in 2006, what happened, one of the things that happened was Israel appointed the head of the Air Force to be the chief of staff. So he had an exaggerated idea of what the Air Force could do. So he didn't want to send in ground troops. So he tried to fight Hezbollah with the Air Force. Well, Hezbollah had dug deep, deep trenches. They had, they could go, they had a whole maze of trenches and so on. So they had the ability to go all over the battlefield, to pop up at places, to attack where they wanted to, and they were immune from Air Force attacks. So they were destroying tanks that were, there were a few ground troops, but not enough. And so, Israel finally had to send in ground troops that kind of managed to pull themselves out. It wasn't certainly a victory by it. Israel kind of got its ass kicked then. But in a sense, you might say that while Hezbollah was very good at finding ways to vulnerabilities in Israeli high-tech, it knew how Israel was going to attack. Israel made a lot of mistakes in terms of the technologies that it employed. So this guy, Don Halutz, who was the head of the Air Force, was quickly fired as a chief of staff, and Israel went back to more of a conventional ground troop sort of attack. So, again, it's all these learning techniques, but Hezbollah has managed in many ways to stay a step ahead of Israel. So that's what gives us hope in that sense, in that, as good as they get, you can find spaces of resistance, and that's some things we have to do. But on the other hand, Hezbollah has no real political program, so I don't know what the point is of, they're attacking and they're winning and they're losing and they're this and they're that, but to what end? I can't really, I don't really know.
Another one question. What do you think about the future of Israel? Israel's plan was to get the land without people.
That's right.
And now we can see that Palestinians are almost 7 million as Israel.
That's right. They're a majority today, the Palestinians. Well, I'm going to talk about this again tomorrow night more, but just in one word, again, I'm part of a movement led by Palestinians, but there's some Israelis involved as well. That's called the One Democratic State Campaign. And we're trying to say that, basically Israel's already created one state. But it's an apartheid state. And so the country has to be transformed from an apartheid state into a democratic state of all its citizens. So Israelis will stay. Nobody's going to throw them out. And nobody's going to close the Hebrew University. You can continue to talk Hebrew and so on. But they'll stay within a democracy of equal rights for everyone. So it'll be a multicultural democracy. And I think that's a solution that the Palestinians basically accept. I don't know many Palestinians that oppose the one-state idea. All right, but we won't go into that tonight. You had one quick?
I'm just wondering with this one state or two states, I don't know what you think about the so-called deal of the century that the Americans came up with apparently now, and what are the chances that with the whole power that Americans and Israelis have together that they would actually fulfill this agreement or this deal?
Trump's ultimate deal?
Yeah.
Well, they might try it. Netanyahu is talking about annexing Area C plus all the settlements to Israel. But, from my point of view, as a proponent of one democratic state, in a sense, the more Israel annexes, the better. Because, it de facto creates, it shows that one state is there. And it also says, finally, the two-state solution is gone. Because that's what all the governments are for. That's what's holding the whole thing together for Israel, this two-state illusion. And if Israel annexes Area C of the West Bank, then it's gone. It's already gone. Trump has already said we don't talk about the two-state anymore. Europe is still holding on to this two-state illusion. But I think in some ways, maybe they're playing into our hands. Because the more that annexation takes place, the more that one state becomes evident, the easier it becomes for us to advocate for an end to apartheid and one democratic state.
So this is how it can become one democratic state after 1 year of Israeli law of Jewish state.
I'm not going to get into that tonight, but let me just say that I think our strategy has to be like that of South Africa. Israel is not going to participate. The Israelis aren't going to participate.
It must be participate. One Palestinian state and one Jewish state.
But it's not going to happen. It's gone.
It must be happy. It can be.
How can it happen?
Before
There's a million Israelis living in the West Bank.
1967, West Bank had been with Jordan, Gaza Strip had been with Egypt, without any Israeli settlement.
But today there's a million Israelis in the West Bank.
Even if it is against the law, you start with this.
All right. But the law doesn't mean much. Who's going to enforce the law? To go back. No, I think we have to bite the bullet that there's already one state.
So I want to return back to your first question. Why all this Israeli crime stay without punishment?
No. You have other settler colonial countries, like South Africa, for example. Well, what happened in Algeria, where the settlers left, is unusual. It doesn't happen usually. And in this situation, the settlers aren't going to leave. South Africa. So the question is, what is decolonization in which the settlers stay? And basically it means that you dismantle the structures of domination of one group over another. You dismantle the structures of control. You create a system where everybody is equal, has equal rights. And the refugees return, which the right of return is crucial to this whole thing. And then when you've gotten to a situation where in a sense you've dismantled the colonial system, then, like it happened in South Africa, then the indigenous population that's been colonized can say, okay, we now, and they're the only ones who can do it, we now accept the presence of Israeli Jews in this country. They're no longer colonists. We've created a new situation, and now we can move on. That's decolonization. In other words, decolonization has to occur in many situations, in a situation where the colonists don't leave. And it's possible to do it. It's not perfect, and I'm sure many Palestinians would rather have the Israelis leave. I can understand that very well. But it's not going to happen, and there's ways, and there's precedents in other countries of settler colonialism ending without the colonial population leaving. So
I want to end with the questions, and I leave you to answer for tomorrow, not today.
okay.
I am Palestinian from Gaza Strip. I spent 35 years as a journalist in Dubai. Now I retire. And I want to return back to Gaza Strip, but I couldn't. Why? Because of Israeli siege, no employment, no electricity, no good water for drinking. I couldn't travel anywhere, no health care, no life. no human right. You can tell me tomorrow what can I do for myself. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff, very much.
Very much.